Yair Lapid, who said of such violence, quote, "It's a stain on Israel. Whoever attacks innocent people is a hooligan and a criminal and is going to be treated as such. There is going to be zero tolerance towards this issue." Well, to discuss this matter, we have joining us this evening Josh Hasten, international spokesman of the Gush Etzion Regional Council in the West Bank, just south of Jerusalem. He speaks to us from Jerusalem. And also with us, we have Rabbi Arik Asherman, co-founder of Jews and Arabs in Defense of Human Rights and former president of Rabbis for Human Rights. He's joining us also from Jerusalem. And Josh, I'm going to let you go first and give you the chance to respond to Yair Lapid's comment calling this a stain on Israel.
First of all, we have to address tonight's terror attack in which one Israeli was murdered by jihadists in northern Samaria. And it's very sad, of course, and very upsetting because we see these attacks on a daily basis. 10 to 15 different attacks. In this case, an Israeli was murdered in cold blood. In regards to the other issue, you're talking about a law enforcement issue. You're talking about something that's sporadic. The leaders of Judea and Samaria time and time again condemn any violence. You have 99.9% of our population, which is law-abiding and peaceful. You do have that fringe element, which, again, is condemned by everyone. So the real story here is the daily attacks on our roads, the daily attacks on our civilians and motorists being carried out by the jihadists, by the Muslims who do not want to see a Jewish presence, not only in Judea and Samaria, but all of Israel. That's really the story here.
Right. Now, Rabbi Escherman, you've been involved in some highly publicized incidents with members of the what's called in Israel the settler community in your work on behalf of Palestinians. I'd like you to respond now to the debate that's been ongoing and the comments by Yair Lapid and what we just heard from Josh Hasten.
Well, first of all, I also, of course, want to extend my condolences to the family of the person who was murdered and for complete and speedy recovery for those who were injured in this terror attack. And of course, I wish we could apply the same standard that we apply when we, from across the political spectrum, condemn Palestinian violence when it comes to Jewish violence or settler violence. It is not sporadic. We experience it daily. Thank God, maybe not murders, but violence. In two villages alone over the last 3 years, I've documented myself over 200 events. There are, and what's most important though, is there are some people like Rabbi Avi Gisar, Ofra, who has been very vocal in condemning the violence from within his own community. All too many people who support the settler movement are silent. It is not true that it's universally condemned. There was a case a couple of years ago when a Molotov cocktail was thrown into a Palestinian taxi and a family was injured. And the rabbi of Bat Ayin, actually, where I was actually recently attacked just a month ago, put a letter asking that there has to be tshuva, repentance, and he was condemned by so much of the community. And again and again, unfortunately, we hear in right-wing newspapers, we see support for the settler hilltop youth who are maybe make a few mistakes, but they're wonderful children.
Okay, Rabbi Ashman,
what we really need is we need both Israeli security forces to do their job, which they haven't been doing, to stop settler violence. And we need people like Josh and people in your community can do a much better job than I can in being much more vocal than you've been up till now in condemning that.
I want to go to Josh. Rabbi Eshman has taken direct issue with some of your comments. So I just think, I'm just giving it to you to respond.
Yeah, no problem. Absolutely. Once again, I'm going to say it loud and clear. We condemn all violence. That being said, I know for a fact your guest has a habit of instigating and really destroying the Sabbath for many of our residents by approaching communities with anarchists and fringe elements of society. So I know his tactics, unfortunately, but does it justify violence? Of course not. And that's why 99.9% of our community condemns violence. Your guest is referring to some incident from 3-4 years ago, one specific thing. Again, We're talking about daily terror attacks carried out by jihadists trying to murder, in this case, this evening, murdered a Jew on the road versus, and I stand by this statement, sporadic incidents which should be dealt with by the proper law enforcement bodies here in Israel, and I believe that they are being dealt with. But you are comparing night and day, and you cannot make, and unfortunately some of our leaders came out with these statements which only inspires and encourages our enemies to go out and carry out more acts of violence, knowing that the government of the state of Israel, certain members, not everybody of course, essentially is going to put a blanket statement over the 500,000 or the 750,000 Jews who live in Judea and Samaria and parts of Jerusalem, and that's really unfortunate.
All right, Rabbi Asherman, Josh did take issue with some of your statements, but he also directly accused you of being an instigator or a provocateur of incidents. So you certainly have to respond.
I think
to that.
that, Pharaoh said that Moses and Aaron were provocateurs for talking to people about their rights. I've never attacked anybody. I've never harmed anybody. I've never, I don't know what he's talking about. Yes. Although I am a Shabbat observant person, there were cases in the last year because the police and army, and we have recordings of our phone calls with the police and army asking them to take care of the settler violence and settler agricultural theft. And there were cases when, because the security forces were not doing anything, that yes, to prevent theft, I was forced to go out on the Sabbath to stop settler thieves who were bringing their flocks and eating what Palestinians were growing in their private fields. If that's a provocation, then I'm a provocateur. But I would take a great umbrage with that. And I, again, would wish that we would also hear, I do agree that it's a small percentage of settlers who are violent. I think there's a much greater percentage who tacitly or actively support it. And I would certainly like to hear the same kind of statements being said that it's really a small percentage of Palestinians who are involved in violence. And I can also tell you that so many times Palestinian parents have told me time and time again, our 10-year-old son wants to grow up and be a terrorist. We want him to meet you and your people to understand that not every Israeli Jew comes to steal our land or steal our olives or uproot our trees or act violently toward us. Yeah. That is the best thing that certainly I can do to protect. As I've had bombs go off not far from my home, it's certainly the best thing I can do to protect my family and my society.
Right. Josh, you can respond as you wish, but do you have a response to Rabbi Escherman's point that the vast majority of the number of Palestinians that commit terror attacks is actually a small percentage, and yet the question is whether they receive tacit support the way Rabbi Escherman is saying that extremists in the Israeli community in the West Bank receive some tacit support?
Well, I'll tell you what you really have here is you have an obsession. It's amazing that you have law enforcement issues which are making front-page headlines and are being discussed at the United Nations General Assembly. I'm talking about all of this talk about so-called settler violence. You know how many people were murdered in Chicago just in the last year alone? You have 1,000 people, 1,000 homicides. Yet a law enforcement issue like that isn't brought up by the UN, isn't brought up by the State Department. There's an obsession here with the communities in Judea and Samaria, and unfortunately, our own government is adding flames to the situation here by making statements like this and not condemning the acts that we see tonight, not condemning the violence, which again is daily. I'm glad that your guest admitted that this was sporadic. Because that's in fact the case. It's a very small percentage. It's not at all worthy of the United Nations or the State Department or something on that level. There is an obsession here with Judea and Samaria. It's been like that for over 50 years, and that is why the spotlight, that's why we're even having this discussion this evening, because the spotlight is always on Judea and Samaria, even though there's terror and wars going on all over the world, yet everyone is focused on... I will say, Josh,
we're having this discussion because both Prime Minister Bennett and Foreign Minister Lapid chose to comment on it, not because the UN did, yes. in this case. But let me go to Rabbi Escherman on Josh's point. He says... It's a disproportionate focus on this phenomena, even if it does exist as you describe it. It's disproportionately focused on.
I think that's a victim kind of crying, I'm the victim. And we all like to say we're the victim. It's very clear that that many people in the world, and certainly the United States and also in international human rights organizations, have condemned Palestinian terror and Palestinian violence. It's just not, I guess I'll also tell you, I expect more of my own people. I want to see my people living up to the values of our Torah, of our traditions, of our values. And to some extent, it doesn't matter to me that much. I mean, it matters to me, but that I don't need to compare myself. Are we better or worse than the Palestinians?
I think, I'm sorry.
I don't want to be involved that our people and our government is using the power of the state to steal Palestinian land,
Rabbi Ashman, we will have to end
and support violence.
We will have to move on. Thank you both, Josh Hasten, Rabbi Eric Ashman, for a serious discussion. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.